I have a feeling that as we've listened over this couple of days, we're aware that there is definitely a new book to be written, if not 2 or 3. And it's great, this wonderful amount of research that adds colour to a woman. Mary told me I didn't need to introduce her. All I had to say was Mary Hind, because everybody knew who she was. And I asked other people, what do you do to introduce Mary Hind? And they said, you just have to say, Mary Hind. Everybody knew who she is. But I was thinking about these books that needed to be written. And there is another one to be written. You know, as you pass through airports or bookshops, there is a book that's called The Book Thief. Now, Mary Hind has done her research mostly within Roehampton archives. So the only contribution that we as a community could do was to offer her the key to the house. The book yet to be written is The Cake Thief. Mary Hind.
Lovely, thank you, Lorraine. I've been told by my sisters of the province, don't ad-lib, you'll go over the time, which is true. But I want to thank my sisters of the province because I feel like a member of the rather unsuccessful English team in the World Cup, but I've had so much, go for it, go for it. But I'm going to ad-lib one thing. Richard needed the backdrop of a new continent. His relentless energy could only thus be expressed. Janet was disciplined for at least 12 years within the confine of those dreaded 33 acres of the Convent of the Sacred Heart, Roehampton, but that was her winter. The seed was hidden, and the life was to come. And actually, those conferences in 1914 are the end. I don't quote them, but you'll see they're where I end. It's where she began, and where we need to begin. Janet Stewart, Mistress of Novices and Spiritual Guide. The title seemed very straightforward when I began, but as I went on I realised it conceals a controversial question that haunts anyone who is entrusted with the guidance of novices. It is the relationship between formation or training within a tradition and spiritual direction as understood in the best tradition today. Early in my reflections, I kept asking myself, what does she think she's doing? And of course, as you can imagine, I asked myself the same question. I gradually came to understand how unjust it is to measure her against the accepted rules and practices of spiritual direction in our time. Clearly, she does not fit that description, nor did she ever claim to. Jesuits did retreat direction. Priests did spiritual direction, not women, at least not in the Roman Catholic tradition. And I don't think she ever questioned that. It was a norm, a fact. Whatever the current orthodoxy, one thing is essential. The work of formation and accompaniment is utterly dependent on the establishment of a personal relationship. So I want to begin. I actually have 5 questions I'm addressing. That's the trouble with that, Jimmy. My 5 questions, my paper is trying to respond to these questions. What was she really like as a person? What were the formative influences that shaped her as an RSCJ? What was day-to-day life in the novitiate like then? How did she exercise the service of spiritual accompaniment? The service of accompaniment. And what has she to say to us today? The work of formation and accompaniment is dependent on the establishment of a personal relationship. So that's where my first question has to be. What was she like? Of course, it's a minefield to try to separate out the real person from the icon we have inherited from those who write about her and their relationship with her. all I can do is add a few more mines to the minefield. I own that Janet Stewart is largely responsible for my being an RSCJ today, so I'm not impartial. In recent months, however, she has emerged out of the rather hazy, even romantic background in which I've held her for years, into someone much more complex, interesting, and surprising. The more I explored her context and practice, the more difficult it was to capture her. I started with a rather static portrait, one in which the artist attempts to produce a true likeness. As I went on, my portrait began to fragment like a Picasso or a Lucien Freud, or, closer to our own experience, that portrait by William Shekel, the ambivalence of that portrait of Philippine, where he captures the complexity as he paints her simultaneously facing in and out of her bonnet, suggesting that the within and the without are one. So I want you to look at 8 portraits. They're all familiar to you, but they are portraits of Janet Stewart at different ages, and I will simply say the age it's at. And just see these layers of complexity, because we're always one person. At the age of 53, '21. '17. 15. 14, my favorite. 9. 6. 3 or 2. She's a person of contrasts and contradictions, like all of us. By nature, I think she thought she was attracted to the byways. She was forced by her giftedness and choices to live most of her life on the highways, in a very public forum. It's this interplay between the inner person and public persona which is hard to capture, but is of crucial importance if we are to grasp the measure of her as someone who worked in the vein of spiritual things, satisfying her own spiritual hunger and thirst whilst helping to spread the banquet before others, to use her own expression in 1914. First and foremost, she was a woman of relationships, with a capacity for friendship and empathy with people of diverse nationalities and ages, laymen and women of different walks of life, clergy, bishops, children, and old children, to use the quaint phrase, and above all her own sisters in community, from aspiring members to her contemporaries, to the frail and the dying in her community. She described herself as excruciatingly shy and said that shyness was her main battlefield, and so it's come down to us as a predominant characteristic. But I question, is she so shy? Or was she perhaps overawed, out of her depth, and still finding herself in the unfamiliar and strange land of religious life? She was, after all, very much the new girl on the block, a recent convert with no connection with the society, amongst several who were educated at Roehampton or Mount Anville? Was she perhaps trying too hard to conform to what was expected? Whether she was shy or a very strong introvert, it didn't prevent her from also being very decisive and confident in her views and ideas. In letters to Digby, the Superior General, when Janet Stewart was the Superior Vicar, it's clear she's in the driving seat when it comes to educational policy. In July 1903, she tells Mother Digby in no uncertain terms that if Catholics haven't got centres in place, the ministers will use the new legislation to get RCs to Protestant training centres. She also claims, presumably Digby has suggested, what about enclosure? She said, we can't, it isn't reasonable. We've got to go out and visit other places and learn. She's on the ball, she's up to date, at least in some measure. She knows when to seek advice, mainly from Jesuits and laymen, especially in finances. But she's not beholden to them. In fact, she takes on Father Daigneau and even the Jesuit Provincial of Ireland with feisty confidence in her ideas about the proposed school in Armagh for training girls for the missions. She's also a forthright businesswoman and a skilled negotiator who gets what she wants. For example, persuading Canon Rooney, a senior dignitary of the Hexham and Newcastle diocese, to accept a deal over the Carlisle property, contrary to his proposal and clearly advantageous in monetary terms to the society. She's no pushover. There is ample contemporary evidence that people of different walks of life found her impressive. One could even say charismatic. Bishops and clerics, to say nothing of her many sisters, were captivated by her warmth and loving interest in them. Her sense of fun saved her from being too impossibly perfect. She was breezy and spontaneous in off-guard moments and in letters to friends, and she could be wickedly irreverent and deflating of clericalism and pomposity. On the other hand, she could be solemn and awe-inspiring when in role. I would imagine that her formidable capacity for work, her intense concentration and ability to multitask, coupled with her impatience with vagueness and the mediocre, and her acute powers of observation, might have made her a bit daunting to lesser mortals. And she could be judgmental on her own admission. Daigneau warns her, be careful not to judge too hastily, too severely. Without shutting your eyes to defects and faults, have them open to see all the good which is done and ready to praise it. In the 1960s, I remember hearing from a couple of older professed one who'd known her, but they lived with people who really had known her and been formed by her. She wasn't everybody's cup of tea, you know. And I begin to understand how this strenuously earnest, practical woman would not have been everyone's cup of tea, with her astonishing eye for detail. And it has to be said, difficulty with delegating. She could be quite interfering and controlling, writing from her travels with suggestions about the scenery for plays and the reading for the community. She was human, complex, poetic, imaginative, witty, and the list could go on. Her wide interests and reading, her engagement with life in all its aspects, her avid interest in classical civilization and history, made me wonder how those who were more prosaic, less comfortable with image, symbol, and literary allusion coped. Could her very intelligence, broad scope, her instinct as an educator and her passion to teach have got in the way of direct, simple, personal communication and empathy with some people? But overall, the letters to individuals impress for their understanding, their sensitivity to each one. Interiorly, there was fragility, even a depressive streak, not uncommon in highly intuitive and sensitive people, which comes to light in the correspondence with Daigneau, in whom she confided her struggles with darkness in prayer. I'm doing day labourer's work, breaking stones, and I'm doggedly hoping against hope, she tells him in November 1899. Which brings me to the second question. What were the influences that shaped her? And Denio was one, but later. For every mistress of novices, the spirit of the formation offered by the society is described in the constitutions and is the formative influence. It is a model that probably came naturally to Janet Stewart's warm and motherly heart. The rule advises the novices to open their hearts to her with great confidence, as to a kind mother full of tenderness and charity in their one-to-one sessions. Her empathy, understanding, encouragement shine through these letters. Another powerful influence was our French heritage. We're within 20 years of the founder's death. Digby gave most of her instructions to novices in French. Jansenism was still thick in the blood, and it certainly made its way over here. It can be picked up in the constant references to penance, mortification, self-abnegation in the novices' journals. It permeated sermons and reading matter. Towards the end of her life, writing to Maud Monaghan, excuse me, towards the end of her life, writing to Maud Monaghan, she says of Jansenism, that heresy makes me more angry than I can say. A remark that throws light on her own battle to be freed from its crippling negative influence. The influence of Mabel Digby as Stewart's novice mistress was hugely significant, perhaps even a bit stifling. According to Monaghan, some people describe Janet Stewart in the early years of her religious life as Digby's shadow. It's clear she loved Digby, but naturally speaking, they seem to have had little in common, beyond being of similar class background, both converts, and both radical in their pursuit of God. As Mary Quinlan points out in an insightful footnote, Janet Stewart actually reveals very little of her inner life in her letters to Digby, perhaps because she intuited that, to the pragmatic Digby, her inner landscape would not be understandable. And yet no one reading the correspondence between them, or the constant concern Janet Stewart expressed about Digby in her letters to others, can have any doubt of the love that existed between them. In some ways, Digby was a mother for Stewart, at a very vulnerable moment in her life, and the relationship between them reminds me of what Janet's father said of his much-loved daughter. Janet gave me everything except her confidence. When Digby left for Rome to become Assistant General, it seems that Janet Stewart began to walk into her own truth and freedom and find her own voice. She was 34 and only 3 years professed when appointed Mistress of Novices. She would have been acutely conscious of being the first incumbent not to have known the foundress. Madeleine Sophie had trained Getz. She, in her turn, trained Digby, who trained Stewart. So we have the direct succession, Barra, Getz, Digby, Stewart, shown in that beautiful book that some of you will have seen in the exhibition at Trahampton. Towards the end of Janet's life, another influence was Mother Teresa Darcy, who was submistress to Digby when Janet herself was in the noviceship. Someone she loved and admired, but she was a much gentler model than Digby. Towards the end of Janet's life, correspondence between them reveal a lovely, easy friendship, which shows that writing to this trusted friend gave her relaxation and space to let down her guard. Another person it's legitimate to assume was influential was Father Galway, S.J. It was he, of course, who had accompanied her on her journey into the church and then the society. He was novice director at Manresa from 1869 to 73. That is, before he knew Janet Stewart. However, subsequently he lived in London, teaching, giving retreats, instructing converts, and was a frequent visitor to Roehampton. In his notice in the Jesuit archives, he's described as a commanding personality. His biographer tells us he emphasised freedom, not conformity, personal responsibility and initiative, together with, quotes, a minimum of regularity and observance to be required of all. All these traits can be found in Janet Stewart. Galway frequently gave retreats and triduums to the community, former pupils. At Roehampton, he did vow ceremonies, and in 1906, the year of his death, the last few lines written on the day before his death were to Janet Stewart. They clearly had much in common, and one can imagine they had many conversations about the training of novices. Later, as has already been mentioned, it was her young Jesuit spiritual director. Damien was actually a novice when he first came to Roehampton, and he's considerably younger than Janet. Friend and confidant, who exercised a wonderful freeing and warm influence on her by encouraging her to follow her natural, compassionate, non-judgmental instincts. It seems that he was to Janet Stewart what César Mathieu was to Madeleine Sophie, a source of freedom and light. And now my third question. What did day-to-day life in the noviceship look like? First, let's set our composition of place with some background facts from the catalogues and personal files of the time. The noviceship was an entity within the larger community of Roehampton. During the years Janet Stewart was responsible for the novices, their numbers in the noviceship fluctuated between 19 and 24 within a total community of around 80. The majority of the sisters, of the novices, were in their 20s, a small number in their late teens, and one or two in their 30s. They were predominantly English or Irish, although there was a surprising mix of other nationalities, a few Australian, one or two French, American, Canadian, Spanish, Swiss, and Italian. From the noviceship journals, we get an idea of life in the noviceship, but it comes, of course, with a health warning. It is one novice's version, and there was probably some internal censorship as to style and content. The journals of 1873 to 91 give an impression of a life wholly enveloped in the spiritual realm, with importance given to talks about the virtues and how to acquire them. In addition, there is great emphasis on developing the habit of virtues, especially of humility, mortification, poverty, perfect obedience, and especially silence of word, action, and heart. This acquisition of virtues is mainly achieved through practices, be they in preparation for feasts, seasons in the liturgical calendar, the feasts of Reverend Mother, of the Mistress of Novices, of the Mother General. The impression given is that virtue is acquired by effort, rather than through the grace of God. To us, it has negative overtones of muscular Christianity and competitiveness. In fact, the latter actually seems to have come from Janet Stewart herself. For example, in 1892, the chronicler records that the practice was extremely complicated, and adds, Mother Stewart said that she made it complicated on purpose, as we generally keep a practice better when it's thus. It's interesting that someone as sane and intelligent as Maud Monaghan comments on this spiritual rivalry in pursuit of virtue quite uncritically. The aim and object of one practice that went on for months was to become a member of the confraternity of the Poor Lazarus. Those who wished enrolled as candidates of the confraternity, and after a month, if someone received 2/3 of the votes of the novices, they became associates. Points to work on were put into a manual with remarks on each point of each week. A committee of 4 was appointed to discuss this. In subsequent months, various entries mention meeting to hear the results of the practice. It seems to be taking over the novitiate life. It began on February the 4th. It seems to go on till October, when a Christmas practice had to be begun. On March the 12th, the chronicler tells us that the committee met in Mother Stuart's room to decide, quotes, on some steps to be taken by which to raise the standards of the practice. It was not to be we were not to be too lenient because some had got off too lightly. Members of the confraternity had scapulars, made a consecration to St. Benedict Love, and then, and this is hard to credit, they met in the attic, which Digby, an honorary member, had given them as an oratory. One entry bravely and rather foolhardily writes, the points on which we were to practice the interior spirit of poverty were, first, and there it ends. There follows a blank page. Clearly the writer gave up. The fact that they lap it all up reveals first the age. Many of these people were just out of school. The era. It's a slightly schoolgirly atmosphere which horrifies us today. And as Siobhan, present-day novice, commented, it strikes me those who didn't get into the confraternity learned the most about poverty. It's also difficult to know quite how seriously they took it. There are clearly moments when they're sending it up, and humour is allowed. One entry describes a hunt for toads, black beetles and worms, which was not very successful because the frost had decimated them. So, quote, repugnancies waiting to be overcome. All this was in preparation to go to the missions. The journals also record holidays, although to us they don't sound much like a holiday. One Easter Monday, she sends them off to find Easter eggs in the garden. They only had time to find 4, because they had to be back at the novitiate for spiritual reading. And then an instruction on, of Père de Ravignon. He's a very famous Jesuit. He's not Jansenist, according to Marie von Duclos, who helped me with this, but he was a close advisor and confidant of Goetz. And his followers were Jansenists. He wasn't, but nevertheless. So they had their instruction on Père de Ravignon on how mortification brings real joy. On another holiday, they were allowed to get up at 4:30 a.m. Right? Clearly, it was important to keep them occupied and all in line. Watch it, novices. However, on Queen Victoria's Jubilee in 1897, they went on the roof to watch the fireworks, and it's evident they really enjoyed it. Other forms of recreation take the form of plays, cricket, treasure hunts, athletics, shuttlecock, sort of badminton, and in her own novitiate, rowing on the lake, though by the time she's novice mistress, that isn't happening. I don't know, perhaps the boat broke. As someone remarked to me, it's all actually rather reminiscent of a Victorian, Edwardian, middle-class household. Now I want to introduce Helen Rumbold. She's a lovely person. She's 10 years older than Janet Stewart and appointed her sub-mistress and then her successor as mistress of novices. Rumbold is a refreshing person, someone to whom Stewart owed a lot. Convert to Catholicism at the age of 22 against much family opposition, she married Sir Arthur Rumbold, a widower twice her age, and so became Lady Rumbold. As the wife of a high-ranking servant of the crown and an aristocrat, he was governor of the Virgin Islands, she travelled a lot and enjoyed a dazzling social life. 9 months into her marriage, her husband's sudden death during a reception left her a pregnant widow. She returned to England, gave birth to her son Arthur, who died of meningitis at the age of 8 in 1877. 5 years later, she joined the society, 6 months before Janet Stewart, the two of them having met before entry as part of the devotees of Galway in the house of mutual friends. I don't know whether it was Mrs. Ross's house, not said. Where Stewart was Digby's favoured child, Rumbold was a challenge to her. In fact, Mother Digby wondered if she would ever settle, and allegedly said of her that, quotes, conventional customs are wholly new to her. I think it must mean conventual customs, the customs of the convent. Poor woman. For Janet Stewart, Rumbold was a wonderful, balancing, complementary influence, saving her from over-seriousness, bringing out her innate humanness and humour. They were close friends until Janet Stewart's death. The noviceship journals of the time when they worked together at Roehampton give us a lively, fun-loving relationship that spills over into the life of the noviceship. There is the description of Rumbold leading the novices in a solemn, secret, silent mystery tour, which ends up in Mother Stewart's room. Mother Stewart by this time is superior, I think, where they spend a happy half hour looking at Ye Olde Fashion Book. Dreamt up by both of them, illustrated by Rumbold, it depicts alternative ways of wearing the habit, including this amazing illustration of how to dress for cricket. Rumbold is described in the typescript Life in our archives, and very strangely there appears to be no lettre annuelle, even though she went on to become an assistant general, as full of life, bringing sunshine to all who were with her. Affectionate, fun-loving, talented with the paintbrush, pen and needle, she was a good foil for Stewart's more reflective gifts and brought out her sense of humour. As a teacher, it's said she was not hampered by method, for she had none. The mistress of studies dispensed her from lesson plans, since she was unable to stick to them. There was always something impromptu and unexpected in order to keep the children on their toes. Most significantly, one of the novices remarked that the relationship between Mother Stewart and Mother Rumbold seemed to her to be one of the loveliest things amongst all those revealed to her in the noviceship. Of course, what is not recorded in the journals is the daily routine, but we can assume that in addition to all the spiritual exercises and instructions on the rule, there was a lot of manual work. Roehampton Convent at the time was a hive of activity. There were, between 1892 and 4, some 174 girls in the boarding school, about nearly 3/4 that number in the poor school, though that fluctuated, and many of the boarding school children stayed during the Christmas and Easter holidays. So they had to be provided with a different programme, but one just as demanding on the nuns. And probably a lot of it fell to the novices and sisters on the practical side. In addition, there was the retreat house, visiting priests, numerous meetings with children of Mary, of Filiae, and old girls, all requiring the practical aspects of loving hospitality. Hard work was considered a virtue and an aid to sanctity, and not only in the convent. Standards in the novitiate were high, and life was meant to be demanding. But the spirit was gentle, at least in principle. And I say that because what we try to do and what we actually do don't always marry, but the spirit was gentle, and Janet Stewart held to that. In what she described as her recollections in tranquility, no, I describe her as that, in 1913, sorry, could be described. During her voyage around the world, she reflects on the spirit of the training offered, and she observes that some are surprised, even disappointed, at the gentleness of the training, but remarks, quote, "In reality it does work as nothing else could. The process of training by severity would have a result contrary to that which is wished for. It would harden the fibre of the soul, which would become inured to this hardness, might become insensitive, almost callous, if the treatment were prolonged. Those exterior practices were the outward expression of the inner work, what we might describe today as the lifelong struggle of whittling away at our egos and self-delusions. And it's this subtle balance between the ideal and reality, the inner and outer work, that we meet the real Janet Stewart, claiming her way, a way of self-knowledge, aided by real psychological insight into the slow process of human development. It was a more nuanced way than Digby's, though it has to be said some of the ways that Stewart's teaching was passed down did not always reflect the gentleness that comes through in her letters. These latter reveal something of what went on in the one-to-one sessions, where hearts could be revealed in safety. So in the next section, I want to take a privileged look. We have to remember it is a privileged look. These were very intimate letters, because I think they are an entry into our fourth question. How did she exercise her ministry of accompaniment? The letters give us an insight into how she saw herself balancing the role of spiritual guide, novice director, and superior of community. And those were combined in many parts of the year, many years of her time. Although I recognise that perhaps it didn't even occur to her there could be a problem in this overlap of relationships. So in this section, I've chosen to use only the letters to individuals and not any of the conferences or instructions to novices. When I started to study the latter, I had difficulty in hearing Janet Stewart underneath the crust of generations of teaching. I was brought up on the instructions on the rule, and whilst I valued them, and I still do, they can strike a somewhat chilly chord with their lofty ideals and endless striving. That's not found in her letters to individuals. However, there is one very significant letter that belongs neither to the individual nor the public, the private nor the public category. Stewart, as Superior Vicar of the English-Irish-Scottish Vicariate, wrote to Digby in 1911, now Mother Digby was now Superior General, outlining what she thought was important in a Mistress of Novices, expressing her reservations about the then Mistress of Novices, Mother Walpole. She writes, "I'm thinking a great deal about Mother Walpole. I'm afraid she's not giving them any serious formation. She has no understanding of the whole discipline that they require, or the formation of habits that are external indeed, but of great importance inwardly." I think that remark helps us to see what Janet Stewart really thought those practices were about. They were an attempt to balance the ideal and practice, as we might say today, to walk the talk. Their importance for Janet was to cultivate inner spaciousness of heart and quiet of mind, and that's what interests her. But she feels that Walpole doesn't get that, and continues her criticism. Her tendency is to think that if one loves God, nothing else matters. And adds something equally damning and serious. She has a great contempt for studies and for les convenances and things of manners and ceremonial, which I think they require now more than ever because they learn so little of them in their own homes. And so much discipline of character and mortification goes with them. Now, I think I've got time for my footnote. I felt that Walpole, I needed to hear the defence, so I went to Walpole's Lettre Annuelle. She comes across as an absolutely lovely, attractive, human person, much loved by the novices. Though the Lettre Annuelle said that then she was sent and she had to move to novices. She only did it for 2 years because actually Janet got her way. And also the person she suggested succeeded Walpole. But the Lettre Annuelle said it really wasn't her. But, you know, she goes on to be superior of here, she goes to Hungary, she's no lightweight. I think this letter of Janet Stewart to Digby, yes, it tells us something about Janet Stewart. I mean about Walpole. But it tells us also something about Janet Stewart. And I think we have to look at the date. It's 1911. Now, the lovely conferences that many of us had the joy of attending last year with Sue, where she traced her spiritual journey, will know that 1911 was really a sort of spiritual breakdown for Janet Stewart, a time of great darkness. And quite clearly, Walpole got under Stewart's skin, and I understand why, because they were polar opposites. No wonder they clashed. For Janet Stewart, to imagine that if one loves God, nothing else matters, which was surely a caricature of Walpole. And in fact, but for Janet Stewart, she sort of took that like that. But there's a lovely story in Mother Walpole's memories of Mother Walpole's, not in the Lettre Annuelle, but there's a typescript, memories, by her novices. And apparently, there was a young member of her community paralysed because she'd been chosen to be the person who the visiting vicar, Janet Stewart, was going to visit her class. And she's in an absolute panic. And she says to Walpole, "But I'm stupid, I can't do it." And Mother Walpole by this time is the superior, I think, and of another house. And that night, under the door of said young nun, came a bit of paper with her class notes sort of shaped up, her lesson plans, by Mother Walpole. And she tells her not to believe she's stupid. The only stupidity is to think that. You know? Everything Fran so clearly presented yesterday of Janet Stewart's educational spirit is the content of her instructions and conferences, including to the novices. Part of the training, and in her eyes the necessary foundation for a deep inner life of contemplation. You will never reach that without study, without serious study and work. But we don't know what went on in the one-to-one conversations. The nearest we can come to them is through the letters to individuals. And here it's very rare that she teaches. Here her focus is on nurturing the life of faith, self-knowledge, and a deep personal relationship with God, especially through companionship with Jesus, friend and brother. To the newly professed Margaret Kenyon, who was teaching at Trahampton, who confided her worries that, quote, plans, schemes, fears, hopes, disappointments take her away from God. She wants to be set aside to pray. Stewart responds firmly, do not pray to be set aside to pray. God would not like it, and nor should I. He loves to see you, full of life, joyful, bursting with desire to do much for his children. You couldn't pray a single bit better if you were set aside from active life, unless it were God's choice for you. And ironically, this is Margaret Kenyon, within a few weeks, this same person was confined to months of bed and in fact years of sickness. She went to bed with TB. She wasn't even allowed to turn the pages of her book. And then Janet Stewart writes to her with such tender encouragement and tender playfulness, begging her not to fight against anything they want to do for you, even against being made comfortable, and tells her, you're doing your invalid duty and God is pleased with you, not for being ill, but for doing good. And later, Janet Stewart thanks Margaret, who sent her some flowers and thoughts. And she says, especially, and I say it low into your ear, for the private offering of £5, adding, you cannot imagine what pleasure it gave me. But in a few months she laments the loss of 3 out of the 5, asking, how could you be so careless? She is, of course, referring to loss of body weight, not pounds sterling. The same message is given in different circumstances to several of those struggling with the balance between the relentless work of class preparation or study and their desire to pray. To Phyllis Mary Ward, who as a new professed was sent to teach at Leamington, she urges, never be discouraged by the difficulties. you will know later how precious they have been. And then, lest this appears to minimise Mary Ward's experience, she adds, "May our Lord bless you and keep you safe in his heart, dearest child. Nestle up to him to love and be loved." You see why, we're getting very close here, but I think we're allowed to quote them. They're already quoted anyway. Bertha Maud put them in Sons and Daughters. In letters to overstretched and discouraged teachers, there are constant exhortations to hope, to trust God utterly, and to remember that on his side he loves you personally and wants you to be his friend, picking up what Sue said yesterday. This tension between action and contemplation was, of course, her own struggle. In 1900, to Daigneault, she writes, "As regards the active life, things have been better. The contemplative's life has not been as good. As one goes up, the other goes down. This is not what ought to be, but what is." The letters are striking too for the degree of trust these young religious placed in her and how she offered them exactly what she herself so valued in the direction she received from Daigneault, the repose of being understood and of speaking without arrière-pensée. Numerous are the examples of her young nuns revealing their vulnerability, their failures, disappointments, moods, depressions, and even difficulties with superiors, similar to the way in which she herself had confided to Daigneault her feelings of sinking, choking, drowning under the weight of responsibility and loneliness, and adding, "Counsellors can only help you so far." There is unmistakable love, compassion, understanding and empathy for feelings of low-grade depression, weariness, the sense of what's the use when everything seems so insignificant and not worth doing. For me, there is a telling characteristic in these letters to young aspirants and newly professed. She manages to identify with what they are experiencing. Rarely does she address her remarks in the imperative, or even directly to you, but subtly identifies with their turmoil without unduly talking about herself. Phrases like, "I know so well those moods of desperation when it seems as if one can go no more." Note it's one, not you, which could sound dismissive or superior. It's because she's been there herself, and she is able to give wise, balanced and gentle counsel, and assure them that she understands from their side. She urges her newly professed cousin Ida Noel to be compassionate to herself. Don't argue with the storm. Don't scold yourself or do violence with your soul. Call it back to God who is its all, and humble it there. The frequently quoted hunting images, which might make one ask what those who were not familiar with that world make of them. The fact is, they are certainly not her only images. These come from nature, the sea, climbing, adventure, and many literary allusions appeal to different individuals. Each letter reveals something personal. When she intuits that Ida Noel is struggling in her first obedience, she says, "I knew you were having a hard time. I knew it all the more because you did not squeal," and encourages her with the words, "No, I'm not a bit ashamed of you, my child. It was better to write to me now than wait for the end. I know so well what it feels like." To the temperamental and fine-tuned musician, probably Bertha McCallick, the writer of the hymn of Our Lady of Aberdeen, who has gone through a tempest of temptation, is how she describes it, just after probation, she writes, "It's not at all unusual, and you know that in your case, things are generally extreme. This is what I advise you to do inside. Set your life to music. Give our Lord your soul's harmonies and melodies. If you let yourself think about disliking anyone who is over you, there will be one of the violins playing false in your orchestra." Do you see what I mean? It must all be music for God. She's always bringing out their goodness, their potential, and asking them to believe it. She seems to have had particular empathy with emotional, passionate and hot-blooded younger, and one hopes older, people. Patience and compassion mark the accompaniment of Margaret Kenyon. Volcanic Margaret, as Stewart describes her fluctuating moods and tempers. She was subject to depression and low self-image. And Janet Stewart writes, do try to believe in the good that is in you and let it out. She tells her that she's not at all surprised by the blackness and desperation of the moods that sweep over you sometimes. It seems to me that I understand them so well and can feel them with you. Hope, this is me. There's hope, patience, trust and prayer are the most frequently advised remedies, and they're offered with gentleness and humour. In another letter to Margaret Kenyon, this is wonderful advice, referring to her mood swings, she encourages her, you cannot help them coming. You can, little by little, help being submerged by them, but admits they're always hard to bear. And then identifies with her by saying, you know it is good for us shy people like you and me to face the things we would gladly run away from. And reminds her, you have oceans to give, only if you undervalue it, you won't bring it out. She's firm, loving, hopeful, always stretching her. To some she urges courage, give more, the magis of Ignatia. Others need discreet counsel to restrain their eagerness. To Sister Noel she writes, lovely this, tentatively, and it's written like this, I wonder, I only wonder, underlined, whether it is exactly more that our Lord asks for. And then says she detects a hint of empressement in her desire and wonders, quote, whether there is not a little vibration of your own voice in that more, and if you would not rather say better, better by the quietness of complete surrender, more interior patience and quiet growth, which is always a slow process and has nothing to show for itself. There must be the repose of winter as well as the full tide of spring. So let your strength be in silence and hope. As we get to know the recipients a little, it's clear that some were rather special. She recognised to Daimyo that she didn't take enough trouble with souls that are less responsive and receptive, sometimes expecting too much of people and perhaps pushing them beyond what they are called to. I find that a very interesting remark. The substantial correspondence that we have shows that the ones she kept up with were often those of similar social background and interests. One such is Emily Monaghan, sister of Maud, younger sister, who is possibly the small child, I think almost certainly the small child Stewart was asked to help in the school when Janet Stewart was a novice, and this person was 9. Letters to her are breezy, playful and intimate, and she tells her, I am and always shall be your mother. Be your own dear mother. I have had you from the beginning, and nothing can ever alter the first close relationship. And she can be very direct with her. Your thoughts are as stupid as can be. God is not what you make out him to be, by those stupid thoughts. And later she rejoices in her triumphs and growth. You cannot think what joy your letter was to me. I held it up to God, and I said, look at Miss Emily. And he seemed so pleased. And through them all, there is a deep sense that she loved them, and that she learnt from them. Now, many of you will have your own favourite quotes that speak to you personally, but I think we would all find the same emphases repeated. Faith, hope, love, unshockable understanding and trust. Trust in Jesus as friend and brother and companion. And trust in God, ever-loving, patient, all-encompassing Father who believes in us and will never give up on us. And I can't resist this quotation in a footnote. This is Janet Stewart writing, Father, but a private paper, Father is the very dearest word to me for God. It is such an immovable name and helps me to understand resignation, surrender, submission, trust, all those simple acts that seem to take one's whole being up to God. So to conclude, what has she to say to us today? To be consistent with what I have learned, I would say that each one of us here has to answer that question for him or herself. My God, perhaps that's what celebrating the centenary of her death is about. The bell's going to go. Of course, there are common themes. God is the centre and purpose, keeping the hearts and minds of those she is guiding fixed on God, but holding herself to see them as God sees them. Souls redeemed by Jesus Christ. Yes, I know about the gong. Yes, thank you. I'm skipping that bit. For Janet Stewart, this work is about helping people to find their purpose and destiny, to live it fully and joyfully. Fundamental to this was her trust. She offered them the space where, free from fear and shame, they might experience that ease of soul she found in Father Daigneault. Leave that bit out. Her knowledge of human nature and its frailties, beginning with her own, gave her understanding and hope. Her spirituality is earthed and alive. She had a deep sense of the inherent goodness of people and material things. I suggest that it is the spirituality of this later Janet Stewart that is her particular gift to us today, when the sheer magnitude of human suffering brought into our living rooms daily through mass media can swamp our joy and hope. That violent comment that Jansenism makes me more angry than I can say speaks of her own struggle to free herself and then others of less than glorious thoughts of God and the world God so loves. And lastly, I think she poses us a question. She might ask us, have we over-professionalised and ring-fenced spiritual direction and made it the domain of a few? For Janet, it was a way of life, a deep part of her telos, what we are all called to in one form or another, as servants and friends of each other on life's journey of exploration into God. This is the fourth means in the original constitutions, every means in their power to spread the love of the heart of Jesus. And in that sense, it has no boundaries, and there are no specialists except the Spirit in each of us. Thank you.